The fluorescent lights of the Mars research outpost hummed a monotonous tune, a stark contrast to the Martian landscape visible through the reinforced viewport. Mark, a man whose face bore the distinct map of a life spent battling bureaucracy and bad coffee, leaned back in his chair, the worn leather groaning in protest. At 42, he'd thought he'd seen it all: language barriers, cultural faux pas, even that one time a delegate from Alpha Centauri tried to trade a priceless artifact for a packet of instant noodles. Nothing could surprise him anymore. Or so he thought. A crackle from the companel shattered the illusion of his quiet morning. Dr. Aries, a woman whose enthusiasm could rival a supernova, announced, "Mark, we've got movement. They're entering the landing bay now. Prepare for first contact." Her voice was pitched high with excitement, as if she were reporting the discovery of a new planet instead of the arrival of some glorified space jellyfish. Mark sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. Right then, he muttered to himself. Time to put on my charming intercultural facilitator hat. He grabbed the tablet that contained the Xylar's basic profile and tried to quickly skim the information. It was mostly scientific jargon and descriptions of their unusual biology, little of it helpful for the real task of making awkward small talk with a floating, tentacled alien. He adjusted his ill-fitting uniform, the dull grey doing nothing to hide the stain from last night's dinner, then made his way to the landing bay. The atmosphere here was thick with anticipation. Scientists in sterile suits fussed over equipment, while a couple of nervous-looking interns looked like they were ready to bolt at any moment. He, however, found himself feeling oddly calm, a sense of professional detachment he'd honed over years of navigating the complexities of interplanetary relations. The landing bay doors hissed open, revealing a large, specially designed transport module. Inside, several massive, transparent tanks shimmered under the lighting, filled with a strange, bluish liquid that resembled both water and a glowing nebula. In each of the tanks, a Xylar was gently floating, their translucent forms pulsating softly. They looked like living constellations, their long tentacles trailing behind them like ribbons of light. They were both beautiful and utterly alien. Mark felt a brief flicker of something unfamiliar, something akin to awe. He pushed it down, reminding himself that these were subjects of study, not ethereal beings. "All right, everyone, let's keep it professional," Dr. Aries announced, her voice echoing through the bay. "Mark, you're with HFY. Remember, slow movements, no sudden noises. Let's make this a positive first contact." Mark nodded, approaching the tank assigned to him. As he drew closer, he could see that HFY was a relatively small Xylar, about 1.5 meters in diameter, with a cluster of light-sensitive organs that served as its face. These organs pulsed with a soft, warm glow, the colors shifting subtly, giving an impression of deep thought. They seemed to be observing him just as intently as he observed them. He cleared his throat and began, "Greetings, HFY. My name is Mark. I am a cultural integration facilitator here at the research outpost. I understand that human language is," he paused, realizing how absurd it sounded to explain language to a being that didn't even have ears in the human sense. "New to you." He finished lamely. HFY's light organs flickered a brighter blue and several of their tentacles rippled slowly. There was no verbal response, no audible sound. Instead, a strange, faint vibration emanated from the water, a low hum that resonated deep in his chest. It was accompanied by a complex change in the bioluminescent pattern of their body, colors shifting through blues, greens, and a hint of violet, then back to a gentle blue again. Mark squinted, unsure what it meant. "Right. Okay," he said to himself, pulling out his tablet. He tapped on a basic greeting phrase in Xylar, a series of symbols he'd practiced until he thought his tongue was going to fall out. Holding it up to the tank, he said, "This is hello. Can you understand?" HFY's light organs flickered again, but their tentacles remained still. The hum in the water intensified slightly, and a new pattern of light appeared on their body, a spiral of pale yellow that appeared and then quickly faded away. Mark watched, utterly stumped. "So," he said, his usual sarcasm creeping into his tone, "I guess that's a no, then?" Dr. Aries, observing from the side, called out, "Mark, perhaps try using the visual aids." Show them the picture of the Earth and then of a human. Mark sighed inwardly, knowing full well this was all a futile exercise. He switched to another tab on the device, showing a picture of the Earth, then a picture of a human. The reaction he received was unexpected. HFY's tentacles shot out, slamming into the glass of the tank with surprising force, and the bioluminescent colors shifted rapidly to a deep, angry red, with sparks of yellow around the perimeter, almost as if their body was about to explode. The hum of the water turned into a high-pitched whine, which made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "Whoa, whoa," Mark said, stepping back. "Okay, not a fan of Earth, I get it. Maybe we'll try something else." He looked around frantically and then noticed the interns in the corner were looking panicked, as they clearly didn't know what to do. Maybe some soothing music? The Xylar profile said they liked. He glanced at the document, complex vibrations. He turned back to HFY and said, "Hang on, let's try something calming." He pulled up a playlist of classical music and started playing Bach. HFY's light show remained in the angry red zone, and the water hummed like an angry hive of bees, and tentacles still slamming into the glass of the tank. Right then, Mark said, pulling his tablet away. "So, not a fan of Bach, Earth, or humans. And here I was, hoping for a warm welcome. This is going to be fun." He turned to Dr. Aries. "Any other ideas?" "Because I'm fresh out." Dr. Aries, despite the chaos, seemed to be grinning with barely contained excitement. "Well, Mark, it looks like you've got quite the challenge on your hands. Just remember, patience is key. We'll be observing you closely, and we'll be here to help." Mark suppressed a groan. He knew this was going to be more than just a little bit challenging. He looked at HFY, whose bioluminescent patterns were still flashing angry colors, and for the first time, he wondered if he had bitten off more than he could chew. He glanced around at the chaos in the room, and then back to HFY, and he noticed, for the first time, the faint tinge of blue in their light show, like a tiny, hesitant question. He smiled, a wry, knowing smile. Right then, he said again, more to himself than anyone else, "Let's try this again." And he prepared to begin his very unusual, and very awkward, job. The next morning found Mark back in the landing bay, staring into HFY's tank with a mixture of trepidation and grim determination. The initial chaos of yesterday had subsided, leaving behind a palpable sense of what now. The scientists were busy analyzing data, while Mark was tasked with the seemingly impossible, bridging the communication gap between a sarcastic human linguist and a sentient, bioluminescent jellyfish. "Okay, HFY," he said, leaning closer to the tank. "Let's try this again. No Earth pictures. No Bach. Just you and me." He felt ridiculous even saying it. It was like trying to have a meaningful conversation with a particularly vibrant lava lamp. HFY's light organs pulsed a soft blue, the pattern shifting subtly. It was less angry than yesterday, but still carried a note of, well, Mark wasn't sure what. Curiosity? Indifference? Mild indigestion? He'd have better luck deciphering a toddler's finger painting. He pulled out his tablet, this time opting for the most basic of concepts. "This," he said, displaying a picture of a circle, "is a circle." He paused, then pointed to himself. "And this is me." HFY's tentacles stirred, one of them extending towards the image of the circle on the screen. It hovered for a moment, then abruptly retracted. The lights on their body pulsed, going from blue to green, then back to blue, but with an added ripple of silver. It was like trying to read an alien mood ring. "Okay, so you know what a circle is?" Mark asked, raising his eyebrows. "Or at least, you recognize the image of one. Does that mean you're picturing it in your mind?" He realized, as he said it, that this was a ridiculous assumption, projecting human cognitive processes onto a being whose biology was completely alien. He tried a different approach, tapping on a basic hello symbol on the tablet. This time, instead of just showing it, he slowly traced the shape with his finger on the glass of the tank. To his surprise, HFY responded. One of their tentacles mirrored his movement, tracing the same symbol in the water, the bioluminescence creating a shimmering line against the blue of the tank. It wasn't perfect, their movements were fluid and a little wobbly, but it was clearly an attempt at imitation. Okay, now we're getting somewhere, Mark muttered to himself, feeling a spark of hope ignite within him. So you understand actions. Great. So how do I get across the idea of coffee? This, he realized, was going to be harder than he thought. How could you explain caffeine addiction to someone who didn't have a digestive system? Or the concept of a morning routine to someone who lived in a giant tank? He decided to start with the basics. He held up a mug, miming taking a sip and making an sound. HFY watched with their usual silent intensity, the blue of their lights deepening slightly. Suddenly, one of their tentacles shot out again, this time not with aggression, but with an inquisitive tap, knocking the mug out of Mark's hand and causing it to clatter across the floor. Great, Mark said, picking up the mug. So, you think I should learn to juggle before trying to explain my caffeine dependency? He tried again, this time holding the mug firmly and miming the drinking action, all the while making exaggerated noises. HFY responded with a series of rapid light shifts, colors flashing between blue, green, and a vibrant yellow, their tentacles moving in a strange, almost dancing, pattern within the water. Mark took a deep breath. Okay, new plan, he said. Forget coffee. Let's just stick to basic concepts. Maybe art? I know we humans like art. He pulled up images of various famous paintings on the tablet and held them up to the tank. Van Gogh's Starry Night, Monet's Water Lilies, and a Jackson Pollock abstract painting. HFY's reactions were interesting. The Starry Night painting caused a soft, rippling pattern in their bioluminescence, colors gently swirling like a miniature galaxy. The water lilies resulted in a more sustained blue, with long, slow movements of their tentacles. But the Jackson Pollock? That sent HFY into a frenzy. Their body pulsed with rapid, chaotic flashes of every color in their spectrum, and their tentacles whipped around in the water, creating a swirling vortex. Okay, no more Pollock, Mark said quickly, switching back to that Starry Night. Clearly you have a sensitive artistic palette. Who knew? He watched as HFY slowly calmed down, their lights returning to a more peaceful pattern. Maybe, Mark mused, you are less like a student, and more like a really complex art critic. He found himself smiling, a genuine smile that wasn't laced with sarcasm. This was unexpectedly engaging. He wasn't just a cultural facilitator, he was a translator for a completely new kind of intelligence. He decided to see what happened if he did something artistic himself. Taking a dry erase marker, he sketched a simple circle on the glass of the tank, then added a few simple lines to make it look like a face. HFY's tentacles moved closer to the glass, tracing the simple face with their tips, their bioluminescence glowing brighter as they did so. It was like watching an alien artist at work. Suddenly, one of their tentacles shot out, tapping the glass directly below the face drawing, then quickly retracted. What was that? Mark asked aloud. He was getting the feeling he was doing something right, but he couldn't quite work it out. He looked at the simple face he had drawn, then it clicked. He had made a basic drawing of a face. An HFY had tapped, almost in the center of where a nose would be. You're saying this is a nose? He pointed to the place where he had tapped. HFY pulsed a brighter blue, and then their tentacles began to move more quickly, creating complex patterns in the water in a way that Mark had not yet seen. It was like watching a whole new language being created in front of his eyes. Mark felt a surge of excitement mixed with a heavy dose of bewildered amusement. He was a linguist, not an artist, and here he was, having a bizarre and wonderful conversation with a tentacled alien using finger paintings and exaggerated hand gestures. He realized, with a start, that he wasn't just observing HFY. He was learning from them too, and he was fascinated. Right then, he said, grabbing another marker. Let's see if you can learn to draw a cat. He felt completely ridiculous, but he also felt like he was exactly where he should be. He found himself smiling again, and as he began to draw, he noticed that XYLA's light pattern shifted, echoing the same kind of playful energy that he was feeling. This was, he realized, going to be an adventure. And despite all the awkwardness, he wouldn't have it any other way. This alien, floating before him, was something special, and he was determined to understand what. The third day of Xylar integration dawned with a nervous energy hanging in the air. Today was the day of the Cultural Exchange Dinner, a carefully orchestrated event designed to foster understanding and goodwill between humans and their tentacled guests. Mark, however, had a sinking feeling that it was going to be more of a cultural collision than an exchange. He felt a headache coming on, a sure sign of impending bureaucratic chaos. The dining hall had been transformed, with one side set up for human consumption, complete with tables and chairs, and the other section designed for the Xylar, with several large, connected tanks filled with their life sea. The tanks had been moved so that they were closer to each other, allowing for interaction and, hopefully, some kind of communication. It looked less like a dinner party and more like a bizarre aquarium exhibit. Mark, dressed in his ill-fitting uniform, felt a wave of sympathy for both species. He was on the human side, feeling a sense of duty. He watched as Dr. Aries, radiating unbridled enthusiasm, made last-minute adjustments to the seating arrangements. She looked like a kid on Christmas morning, completely oblivious to the potential for disaster. "Mark, are you ready?" she chirped, her eyes sparkling. "I think this is going to be a fantastic opportunity for cross-cultural understanding." Mark managed a weak smile. "Right, fantastic. I'm sure the Xylar are just dying to try our patented nutrient paste. It's a culinary delight," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The Xylar were brought into the hall, their tanks gliding smoothly through the designated pathways, and placed in the space prepared for them. As they entered, the room was bathed in a soft, multicolored glow. The Xylar, responding to the change of environment, began to display complex light patterns, moving their tentacles with a slow, rhythmic grace. XYLA's tank settled into position opposite Mark's table, and their light patterns seemed to intensify as they observed the humans. The human side of the room began to settle as well, and everyone was seated. Mark was directly across from XYLAR, making it difficult not to stare. He found it hard to focus on anything else. Dr. Aries began with a welcoming speech. "Welcome, everyone. We are so excited to share this meal together, and we hope that this will be an opportunity for us to learn and grow from each other. We have prepared some dishes that we think you will enjoy, and we can't wait to see your reaction. Please, dig in." As she said the words, all hell broke loose. The human diners began to cautiously sample the dishes on offer, or a bland, but nutritionally balanced, chicken casserole, some steamed vegetables, and a gelatinous dessert that looked suspiciously like something that had been extracted from a science experiment. The general consensus was legible, but not enjoyable. The Xylar, on the other hand, had a completely different reaction. XYLAR moved to the edge of their tank and extended a single tentacle, touching the side of the bowl of casserole. The moment the tentacle made contact with the food, their bioluminescence flickered violently and a high-pitched, almost painful, hum filled the room. All the Xylar began to react in the same way, their lights changing from a soft blue to a deep, angry red, the hum from their tanks reaching an almost unbearable level. It was very obvious that the Xylar were in distress. "Oh dear," Dr. Aries said, her face falling. "That's not good." Mark, on the other hand, wasn't surprised in the slightest. He grabbed a datapad to look at the profile, and then read out, "Yes, it seems that human food is categorized as a highly toxic by the Xylar. We probably should have checked that before we put it out for them." He shook his head in disbelief. "Seriously, did no one think that we should have found out about their biology before we decided to feed them?" He pushed away his own food, it suddenly felt a lot less palatable. "Well, that was a mistake, and it appears the Xylar are not impressed with our cooking skills," Dr. Aries said. "Let's move on to the second part of our cultural sharing. XYLAR, we would love to hear from you." Mark stared at the tank opposite and suppressed a groan. This was going to be even more of a disaster. XYLAR didn't even have a voice. How was she going to talk to anyone? He looked at them and saw that their light patterns seemed more complex and faster now, and they were moving their tentacles in a way he had never seen before. He had a feeling that they were trying to communicate. He watched, and slowly, he started to understand. The changes in light patterns and movement were creating a kind of shared understanding between them. He realized, suddenly, that he was actually understanding some of what they were trying to say. He felt a wave of shock, and also a surge of energy. He looked at the others at the table and said, "Actually, I think that they are communicating, just not in the way that we expected. I can feel something. It is like I am starting to understand them." Everyone looked at him like he had just grown a second head. "Mark, are you feeling okay?" Dr. Aries asked, her brow furrowing. "I am fine, just try to focus and understand the movements. Don't try to hear or see, just feel." He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, and focused on the feeling. He reached out with his mind, and for the first time, he felt the feeling back, a response from HFY. He opened his eyes and stared at the tank. "HFY, are you saying that this is all wrong? That you don't do a dinner like us? That you share it differently?" HFY's light pulsed a bright, almost blinding white, and they moved their tentacles in a slow, graceful swirl within the water, a pattern that Mark suddenly understood as meaning yes. "Okay, so a dinner is not for you. And you share differently?" Mark said, trying to formulate the words. HFY responded again, with a new set of patterns. Mark closed his eyes again, feeling the strange telepathic connection, as HFY tried to explain their concepts. "I think they are saying that sharing is not about food, but about energy? Or shared understanding?" He opened his eyes, a strange feeling of exhilaration running through him. This was incredible. The other humans in the room were still staring at him with a mix of confusion and disbelief. He didn't care. He knew he wasn't making this up. He had made some kind of connection with HFY that he could not explain. Later that evening, after the disastrous dinner, Mark found himself back in the landing bay, staring into HFY's tank. He felt a strange sense of connection to them now, a bond that had formed in the midst of all the confusion and chaos. He was beginning to understand them, and that was a huge surprise to him. HFY was moving slowly in their tank, their bioluminescence soft and gentle now, a stark contrast to the chaotic light show they had displayed earlier. Mark rested his hand on the glass, watching as their tentacles moved closer, mirroring his actions. As he stood there, late into the night, he felt a change in the atmosphere. A new tension, one that he didn't understand, was creeping into his awareness. He could hear the gentle hum of the water, the soft whooshing of the filtration system, and the distant sounds of the outpost. But also, something else. A feeling, as if HFY was whispering secrets, not through language, but through the water and through his mind. He closed his eyes, leaning his head against the tank, and listened. It was the strangest thing he had ever experienced. The water felt warm and alive, and he was surrounded by feelings that he didn't understand, a strange mix of emotions that seemed to belong to both him and HFY. He realized, as he stood there in the dark, that their connection was deeper and more complex than he could ever have imagined, and that this was just the beginning of the journey. He felt drawn to them, in a way that he could not explain, and he knew he wasn't going to be able to just walk away. He was entangled, like an insect in a spider's web. But, strangely, he wasn't afraid. He was curious. And he had a feeling that this was only going to get more complex, and a lot more interesting. The morning after the disastrous cultural dinner was strangely quiet. The scientists were huddled over their data, the interns were keeping their distance, and the usual hum of the research outpost seemed muted. Mark, however, felt anything but calm. His head was buzzing, his mind still reeling from the strange connection he had felt with HFY the night before. The sensation of shared emotions, the feeling of being somehow linked to this alien being, was both exhilarating and deeply unsettling. He found himself drawn to the landing bay, almost against his will. The moment he stepped inside, his eyes went straight to HFY's tank. They were moving slowly, their bioluminescence displaying a complex pattern of blues and greens, with a new, almost hesitant, flicker of yellow. It was as if they were trying to communicate something specific. "Morning, HFY," Mark said quietly, resting his hand on the tank. "Did you sleep well?" He knew how ridiculous it sounded, asking a jellyfish-like alien about their sleep patterns, but he felt strangely compelled to do it. HFY responded by extending a tentacle, gently touching the glass near his hand. The lights around their body pulsed softly, a feeling of gentle curiosity washing over him. It was as if they were saying hello back. It was also strangely intimate. He was pulled out of his musings by Dr. Aries approaching him. "Mark, we need to talk." Her usual enthusiasm was replaced by a more serious tone. "What's up?" Mark asked, trying to sound casual. "It's about the Xylar. We've been analyzing the data, and, well, it appears that they are entering their mating season." Mark raised an eyebrow. "They're a mating season?" He was very aware that he had a large gap in his knowledge about that specific area of their biology. "Yes," Dr. Aries said, pulling up a series of complex diagrams on her tablet. "It's a multi-week period of heightened activity and specific biological changes. According to our analysis, their bioluminescence will become more intense and erratic, their behavior will change, and they will become more receptive." "Receptive?" Mark asked, feeling a flicker of something unfamiliar run through him. It felt a bit like being caught in a trap. Dr. Aries hesitated, a slight blush rising on her cheeks. "Well, yes. The Xylar mating process is unusual. They don't have traditional mating in the human sense. It's more of a symbiotic exchange, an energy transfer, and a kind of shared experience." She seemed to be having trouble formulating the words. Mark, despite the awkwardness of the conversation, felt a sudden surge of curiosity. "Shared experience?" he asked, trying to keep his tone neutral, but his mind was racing with possibilities, and none of them were professional. Dr. Aries nodded, clearly uncomfortable. "Yes, we don't understand all of it. But, according to the profiles, it's a complex and intense period for them. And we need to be prepared for some unusual behavior." Mark stared at HFY's tank, his mind racing. He looked at them and realized that their bioluminescence was indeed changing, becoming more complex and intense. The hesitant yellow flashes had become more frequent, the blues and greens swirling in a way that felt almost alluring. It was as if they were somehow becoming more alive, more vibrant, more present. He found himself wondering what it would feel like to be a part of that shared experience. He shook his head to clear the thought, feeling a strange mixture of desire and fear. This was dangerous territory, both scientifically and personally. "So, what am I supposed to do?" he asked, trying to refocus on the task at hand. "Just continue your work," Dr. Aries said, her voice slightly strained. "But be aware that their behavior might be unpredictable. And please, try to maintain some level of professional distance." She looked at him, a mixture of worry and warning in her eyes. "Right, professional distance," Mark muttered to himself. "Easy for you to say." Later that day, Mark found himself researching Xylar biology, trying to understand more about their mating season. The scientific descriptions were clinical and detached, but he found himself reading between the lines, trying to imagine what it would actually feel like. He read about the heightened sensory input, the intense emotional connection, the exchange of bioluminescent energy. It all sounded incredibly intense, and very confusing for a human mind. He felt an unexpected pull towards HFY, a feeling that was both thrilling and terrifying. He tried to rationalize it, telling himself it was just scientific curiosity, but he knew, deep down, that it was something more. He was feeling something that was completely beyond his experience, a strange and compelling pull towards an alien being. He went back to the landing bay, seeking answers, or at least some kind of explanation. As he approached HFY's tank, he noticed that their light pattern was even more erratic, colors swirling in a hypnotic dance. He placed his hand on the glass, and as he did, a surge of energy flowed through him, a feeling of warmth and intense emotion. It was as if HFY was reaching out to him. He gasped, pulling his hand back, feeling overwhelmed by the intensity of the sensation. He closed his eyes, trying to calm his racing heart, when he felt it again, a gentle touch, like a whisper of light, this time on his mind. He opened his eyes, staring at HFY. They were still moving, their tentacles flowing within the water. Their light organs pulsed, colors shifting from deep blue to a vibrant green, then to a soft, inviting yellow, followed by a surge of crimson red, before finally settling into a soft blue again. Mark felt his heart pounding in his chest, and he started to think he was losing his mind. This was all too much. He was feeling things he didn't understand, he was drawn to this alien in a way that made no sense, and he felt like he was on the edge of something incredible. He looked at HFY, a strange longing in his heart. He wanted to understand, to be a part of their world, even if it was completely beyond human comprehension. He knew he was falling for them, in a way he never imagined possible. He was completely and utterly lost. He wanted them in a way that was both exciting and also deeply terrifying. He wanted to touch them, to be closer to them. It was a terrible and incredible feeling. And he knew he was in deep trouble. The research outpost was in chaos. The Xylar mating season had officially begun, and the usually placid, floating aliens were now anything but. Their bioluminescence was in full bloom, their light patterns flickering and swirling like miniature, underwater raves. The tanks hummed with an almost palpable energy, and the scientists, despite their best efforts at maintaining a professional facade, were visibly on edge. Mark, however, was experiencing a whole new level of chaos. His feelings for HFY had intensified to a point where it was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain even the pretense of objectivity. The shared connection he had felt before was now almost a constant hum beneath his skin, a feeling of both intense longing and utter confusion. He found himself spending almost all of his free time in the landing bay, observing HFY. Their bioluminescence was mesmerizing, the colors shifting and swirling in ways that seemed to speak to something deep inside him. Their tentacles, once just appendages, now seemed to possess a grace and fluidity that was both alluring and unsettling. One morning, as Mark entered the landing bay, he noticed that HFY's light patterns were particularly complex. They were moving their tentacles in a slow, almost rhythmic dance, and their body was pulsing with a kaleidoscope of colors. He rested his hand on the tank, and a surge of energy flowed through him, more intense than before, sending a shiver down his spine. "Whoa," he muttered, pulling his hand back. "Okay, that was something." He suddenly felt flustered, his cheeks flushed with heat. This was getting ridiculous. He looked at the diagrams of Xylar mating rituals he had been studying the night before, and then back at the tank, and then it suddenly hit him. The patterns, the colors, the movements, it was a mating display. HFY was putting on a mating display for him. He felt a wave of both panic and excitement, a confusing cocktail of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. He realized, completely and utterly out of his depth. He had been trying so hard to be the rational, objective observer, and had completely failed. Okay, calm down, he muttered to himself, trying to regulate his breathing. He glanced around the landing bay, but thankfully it was relatively empty. The other scientists seemed to be avoiding him, probably sensing that he was about to lose his mind. He pulled out his tablet and began scrolling through the diagrams again, trying to find some kind of reference point. He read about the symbiotic exchange, the merging of energy, the sharing of emotions. It all sounded incredibly intense, and he was absolutely certain that he had no idea what he was doing. He glanced up and saw that HFY was moving closer to the glass, their light patterns intensifying as they observed him. One of their tentacles extended towards him, gently tracing the glass where his hand had been moments before. He felt a strong pull, an urge to reach back, to touch them, to somehow connect. He knew it was a terrible idea, he knew it was breaking all of the rules, but he couldn't help himself. He slowly reached out, placing his hand on the glass once more. HFY's tentacle mirrored his movement, and the moment they made contact, a wave of pure, unfiltered emotion washed over him. It was a mix of longing, desire, curiosity, and something else, something that felt both familiar and utterly alien. He gasped, his heart pounding in his chest. he was drowning in emotion, and was completely overwhelmed. He pulled his hand back, breathing heavily, his face flushed. What was he doing? This was madness. He looked up at HFY and started to panic. He had to do something, and very quickly. He had completely lost control. He looked around for a solution and then realized that he wasn't going to find one. His feelings were starting to completely overwhelm him, and he felt that he was no longer capable of making rational decisions. He knew, intellectually, that what he was doing was wrong. He knew that he was crossing lines that should never be crossed. He also knew that he didn't care. He found himself almost stumbling over to the side of the tank, where the controls were located. He started to press buttons. The water in the tank started to vibrate slightly, and then one of the sides of the tank opened. "Mark, what do you think you are doing?" he heard Dr. Ari say from across the room, but he couldn't focus on anything except HFY, who was drifting slowly towards him. He took another deep breath, trying to compose himself. He knew that he was about to make a decision that would change everything. He turned to HFY, their light pattern swirling with a mix of curiosity and anticipation, and reached out his hand. HFY slowly extended one of their tentacles, and Mark took it. The moment their skin touched, there was an explosion of light and energy, a feeling of connection so intense it was almost overwhelming. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the feeling, letting go of his fear and embracing the unknown. And then the feeling changed. It was not at all what he expected. It was not a sexual or romantic connection, but a shared experience, an almost telepathic understanding. And it was not individual, but something shared between every Xylar, a communal consciousness. He had somehow connected to the whole race, not just HFY, and he realized, with a jolt, what they were doing, and that he had utterly misunderstood their mating rituals. He realized that in their culture, this kind of intimate contact was as normal as sharing a meal, and it didn't mean what he had thought it meant. He had completely and utterly made a fool of himself. He broke the connection and pulled back, his face flushing scarlet, and looked at the others across the room. It was clear, from their expressions, that they knew exactly what he had done. He looked at HFY, a mixture of humiliation and confusion washing over him, and knew that he was going to have a very, very awkward conversation very soon. But he also knew that in that shared moment, he had learned something very important about Xylar culture and about himself. He was, it seemed, a bit of a hopeless romantic. The aftermath of Mark's spectacular misinterpretation of the Xylar mating ritual was, as predicted, excruciatingly awkward. The scientists, initially stunned into silence, now bombarded him with a mixture of concerned inquiries and barely suppressed laughter. Dr. Aries, bless her optimistic soul, tried to frame it as a valuable learning experience, but the knowing smirks from the interns told a different story. Mark, meanwhile, wanted to crawl into a hole and die. He'd not only misread the situation entirely, but he'd done so in a spectacularly public fashion. He could practically feel the judgment radiating from the walls of the landing bay. He found himself back in front of HFY's tank, the scene of his embarrassing blunder, feeling a deep sense of humiliation. He looked at them, their light patterns pulsing softly, a mixture of curiosity and something he couldn't quite decipher. He wondered if they were laughing at him too, in their own silent, bioluminescent way. So, he began, rubbing the back of his neck, about yesterday. HFY responded with a series of complex light shifts, accompanied by a soft hum from the water. Mark closed his eyes, focusing on the now familiar feeling of their connection. He could sense amusement, but not mockery. More like a gentle understanding, a recognition of his human awkwardness. I really messed that up, didn't I? He asked, feeling a blush creep up his neck. The feeling he received back was surprising. It wasn't judgment, but a wave of reassurance. Comfort? It was as if HFY was saying, "It's okay, you silly human. We all make mistakes." Mark opened his eyes, a small smile playing on his lips. Well, that's good to know. Because I think I just set a new record for interspecies awkwardness. He spent the next few days trying to repair the damage to his reputation, and also trying to understand what exactly had happened during that shared moment with HFY. The scientists had recorded the entire incident, and the data was baffling. Mark's brainwaves had shown a level of synchronization with the Xylar that was completely unprecedented. It was as if, for a brief moment, he had become part of their collective consciousness. He began spending even more time with HFY, and he felt his connection to them deepening, evolving into something more than just a linguistic link. He was starting to understand them on a level he never thought possible, not just their language, but their emotions, their way of thinking, their perception of the world. He found himself picking up on their silent communication, their subtle shifts in light patterns and tentacle movements, almost as if he were becoming Xylar himself. One evening, as he sat by HFY's tank, he felt a sudden surge of emotion, a wave of sadness that seemed to emanate from them. He closed his eyes, focusing on the connection, and saw images flashing through his mind, images of a vast, dark ocean, a swirling vortex of light, and a feeling of profound loss. "What is it?" he asked aloud, his voice laced with concern. "What's wrong?" HFY responded with a series of slow, mournful pulses of light, their tentacles drifting listlessly in the water. Mark felt a pang of empathy, a deep understanding of their sadness, even though he couldn't fully grasp the cause. He reached out, placing his hand on the glass, and sent a feeling of comfort, of reassurance, through their connection. HFY responded with a soft pulse of blue, a feeling of gratitude and acceptance. As he sat there, sharing their sadness, he realized that their connection had transcended the boundaries of language and species. He was no longer just a translator, he was a confidant, a friend, a something more. He was a part of their world, and they were a part of his. The other scientists began to notice the change in Mark, the way he seemed to anticipate HFY's needs, the way he communicated with them without words. They were both intrigued and a little unnerved. "Mark," Dr. Ari said one day, her voice laced with concern, "are you sure you're okay? You seem different." Mark smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. "I'm fine," he said. "Better than fine, actually. I think I'm finally starting to understand." He continued to explore his connection with HFY, pushing the boundaries of communication and understanding. He learned about their history, their culture, their hopes and fears. He learned about their complex social structure, their intricate mating rituals, and the deep, almost spiritual connection they shared with their home world. And as he learned, he grew closer to HFY, their bond deepening with each shared experience. He began to see the world through their eyes, appreciating the beauty and complexity of the universe in a way he never thought possible. He also realized that the connection he felt was no longer just platonic. The line between friendship and something deeper and more profound was very quickly fading. He started to imagine what it would be like to truly share his life with HFY, a human and an alien in a relationship that defied the very definition. He didn't yet know what the future held, but the idea was no longer absurd, and instead, it was strangely alluring. The research outpost was buzzing, not with the chaotic energy of the mating season, but with a different kind of excitement. Mark's unique connection with HFY had become the subject of intense scrutiny, both scientific and gossipy. The scientists, initially skeptical, were now fascinated by the depth of their communication, while the support staff whispered amongst themselves, speculating about the nature of their relationship. Mark, however, found himself increasingly detached from the whispers and speculation. His world had narrowed down to HFY, their shared understanding, their silent conversations, and the strange, beautiful intimacy that had blossomed between them. One evening, as Mark sat by HFY's tank, he felt a new kind of urgency from them, a sense of longing. He closed his eyes, focusing on their connection, and saw images of a vast, shimmering ocean, a world of vibrant colors and fluid movements, a world that was both familiar and utterly alien. It was HFY's home, a world they deeply missed. "You want to go home," Mark whispered, his voice thick with emotion. HFY responded with a slow, pulsing wave of light, a mixture of sadness and hope. Mark felt a pang of sympathy, a deep understanding of their longing. He knew, in that moment, that he couldn't keep them here, confined to a tank in a research outpost, no matter how strong his feelings for them were. He had to find a way to help them return home. He began researching Xylar planetary systems, looking for anything that might help him understand their needs, and also for any way that he might be able to create a suitable environment for them on Mars. He realized, quite quickly, that they were very different from humans in their need for water, and that the kind of water they needed did not exist on Mars. He was going to have to find a solution. He spent weeks poring over data, consulting with xenobiologists and engineers. The solution, when it came, was audacious: to create a self-contained, bioluminescent ecosystem, or a kind of life sea, within the research outpost. A place where the Xylar could thrive, a place that would mimic the conditions of their home world. The idea was met with a mixture of excitement and skepticism. Dr. Aries was enthusiastic, seeing it as a major breakthrough in interspecies relations. Others were more cautious, concerned about the resources and the potential risks involved. But Mark was determined. He knew that this was the only way to give Xylar what they needed, and the only way for them to continue their relationship, whatever form it took, on Mars. He worked tirelessly, pushing himself to his limits, and started to make progress. He began to work with the Xylar specialists to create an environment suitable for the Xylar on Mars, something that would mimic their natural habitat. The work was hard, and long, and demanding, but he found strength and resilience within their connection. He was doing this, not just for science, not just for the research station, but for Xylar. For their future. That Life Sea project became his obsession. He spent every waking moment designing, planning, and overseeing the construction of the massive, transparent dome that would house the ecosystem, working closely with the Xylar to ensure that everything met their specific needs. He felt an unexpected strength from the connection they shared. As the project neared completion, Mark felt a growing sense of anticipation, but also a tinge of sadness. He knew that once the Life Sea was operational, Xylar might choose to leave, to return to their home world. The thought of being separated from them, after sharing so much, filled him with a deep ache. The day of the Life Sea's activation was a momentous occasion. The entire research outpost gathered to watch as the massive dome shimmered to life, the specially formulated water glowing with a soft, bioluminescent light, mimicking the colors of Xylar's home ocean. Mark watched as Xylar was carefully transferred into the Life Sea. Their light patterns pulsed with excitement, their tentacles swirling in the water, exploring their new environment. It was a beautiful and poignant moment. As Xylar settled into their new home, Mark felt a mix of emotions: joy, relief, and a bittersweet sense of loss. He knew that their relationship had reached a turning point. He approached the edge of the Life Sea, his heart pounding in his chest. "So," he said, his voice slightly hoarse, "what do you think?" Xylar responded with a brilliant display of light, a kaleidoscope of colors that filled the dome, expressing a profound sense of gratitude and something more. Something that felt like love. Mark smiled, tears welling up in his eyes. He knew, in that moment, that their journey together wasn't over. It was just beginning. The future was uncertain, uncharted territory for both of them. But one thing was clear: their connection, their shared understanding, had broken down barriers not just between species, but between worlds. And as Mark stood there, gazing into the shimmering depths of the Life Sea, he knew that he was ready to explore whatever the future held, with Xylar by his side, in whatever form that might take. He had found love in the most unexpected place, and it was the most wonderful and most confusing thing he had ever known.